Imagine waking up in ancient Egypt, and instead of the usual blazing sun, you hear rain. Not for an hour, not for an afternoon. It keeps falling. The streets turn to mud, water starts collecting around homes, and people begin wondering, what happens when a civilization built around the Nile suddenly gets far more water than it expected? Because ancient Egypt was one of the driest places in the ancient world. Rain wasn't the main thing people planned their lives around. So when unusually heavy rain arrived, it could create problems that most of us never associate with Egypt. Start with the house. Most ordinary Egyptian homes were built largely from mudbrick. In Egypt's normally dry climate, that was an excellent building material. But prolonged rain was a different story. Water could weaken exposed brick, damage walls, and create leaks. So after heavy rain, repairing the house could become more important than simply waiting for the weather to improve. Roofs needed attention, walls needed checking, and anything valuable had to be kept away from water. Then there was the ground. Ancient Egyptian streets weren't paved like modern roads. Many were simply packed earth. After days of rain, those surfaces could become muddy and difficult to cross. Carts became harder to move, animals struggled through the soft ground, and carrying supplies became much more difficult. So if you didn't absolutely need to travel, you probably waited. But Egypt couldn't simply stop moving. Grain still had to be transported. Goods still had to reach settlements. People still needed to cross the region, and this is where the Nile became especially important. Boats could move cargo without relying on muddy roads. But even the river wasn't completely immune to bad weather. Strong winds and rough conditions could make boat travel more dangerous. So a period of heavy rain could temporarily slow down transportation across both land and water. Then comes agriculture. This is where ancient Egypt gets really interesting. Egyptian farming depended heavily on the Nile and irrigation. Farmers understood the river's seasonal patterns and organized their work around them. Rain was different. A sudden downpour could arrive outside the normal agricultural rhythm. Fields could become excessively wet, soil could be disturbed, and work that normally happened according to a predictable schedule could be delayed. But the biggest concern wasn't necessarily losing one day's work. It was protecting the food supply. Grain was one of the most important resources in Egyptian society. It fed people. It could be stored. It could be redistributed. And it was connected to taxes, wages, and rations. So keeping grain dry was extremely important. If water reached stored grain, the problem could become much larger than a wet floor. Spoilage could threaten supplies, which means a long period of rain wasn't simply a weather problem. It could become a food storage problem. And then there was something even more dangerous: flooding in places where people weren't expecting it. The Egyptian desert contains dry valleys and channels known as wadis. Most of the time, they can look completely harmless, but heavy rain falling somewhere nearby can send water rushing through them. Suddenly, a dry path can become a dangerous stream. And that meant knowing the landscape mattered. People had to understand which routes were safe after rain, and which ones could become dangerous. But rain wasn't always bad news. A rare rainfall could temporarily transform parts of the desert. Plants could appear, animals could become active. Water could collect in places that were normally completely dry. For people traveling through desert regions, that could be useful. But it could also be unpredictable. A temporary water source could help you, while a flash flood somewhere else could put you in serious danger. And ancient Egyptians didn't have weather apps telling them where the storm was going. They relied on observation: clouds, wind, the condition of the ground, the behavior of the river, and knowledge passed down through generations. If a particular road became dangerous after heavy rain, people remembered. If a house regularly leaked in a certain place, people repaired it. If water rushed through a particular valley, that information became part of local knowledge. So when rain continued for days, people weren't completely helpless. They already understood their environment. They simply had to adjust. Outdoor work could be delayed, travel could be reduced, food and belongings could be protected, buildings could be repaired, and dangerous areas could be avoided until conditions improved. Meanwhile, life inside the household continued. People still had to prepare food, look after children, care for animals, repair equipment, and manage whatever supplies they had. A week of rain didn't freeze society, it changed what people could safely do. And eventually, the clouds disappeared, the ground began drying, the roads became usable again. Fields could be worked, boats could move, and ordinary life returned. That's what makes prolonged rain in ancient Egypt so fascinating. The Egyptians were incredibly dependent on water, but they didn't depend on water arriving from the sky. Their civilization was organized around the Nile. So rain could be both useful and disruptive depending on where it fell, how heavily it fell, and how long it lasted. They didn't have modern drainage systems. They didn't have weather forecasts. They didn't have waterproof construction materials like we do today. Instead, they had something much older: experience. They knew their houses, they knew their fields, they knew the river, and they knew the landscape. So what did ancient Egyptians do when it rained all week? They protected their homes and food, reduced unnecessary travel, adjusted agricultural work, watched the river, avoided dangerous areas, and waited for the ground to dry. They couldn't control the weather, but they could control how they responded to it, and that's the part we often miss when we imagine ancient Egypt. The civilization wasn't built only around the Nile. It was built around understanding exactly how water behaved, whether that water came from the river, or unexpectedly, from the sky. If you enjoyed this journey into the everyday side of ancient Egypt, subscribe to the Ancient Egyptians for more stories about how ordinary people lived, worked, survived, and adapted thousands of years ago. And I'll see you in the next one.